folks, I took a ride north up to New Hampshire yesterday to pick up a bunch of Gravely equipment. A customer of mine wanted to clean out all of his excess Gravely items, so I took a ride up to help him do just that. And upon arrival, this was sitting next to the pile of Gravely stuff, and I thought it was pretty cool, being a unique machine and all that, so I took an interest in it and talked to him about it for a little while, and he was gracious enough to let me take it along with all the Gravely stuff, so I was very happy about that. And I greatly appreciate it too. It's going to make a nice addition to the equipment lineup for this year's shows. So I've seen a lot of Eclipse reel mowers over the years, either for sale or at the shows and whatnot, but this is the first Eclipse sickle bar mower that I've ever seen. And from what I can find digging around online, there's really not too much on them. There's a couple of more videos here on YouTube, but they're unfortunately not in this nice of shape. He kept this thing in his barn all the time, did use it around his property for quite a while, and then of course stopped using it probably 5, 6, 7 years ago. The engine doesn't have any compression. I imagine the valves are stuck open, and he was having ignition issues with it before he stopped using it. But the gas tank on it is clean. Engine, obviously enough, spins over. It's pretty winded. Like I said, there's no compression. I think it's just got a stuck valve. And the mechanics of it are all together and everything is there. It is missing, from what I have seen, there's a bar that comes up off of here, which looks like it snapped off years ago, because there's a wear mark here just to keep the grass moving as you're cutting stuff from side to side. He did say that he replaced this wooden actuator lever at one point in time too, and the teeth are in fairly decent shape. There's a couple of chunks missing here and there, but it's a very nice original condition machine, and it's a beautiful shape for the age. Judging by the serial number on the engine, it's a 1954. So it's pretty cool. It's pretty correct with all this 40s and 50s stuff that I've been finding. So anyways, folks, we're going to get this outside, clean off all this barn dust and some of the grease and everything, and then we can start getting into this engine and see about getting this thing running again. Well, and now that all the barn dust and everything is cleaned off, this actually turned out to be a fairly nice machine. Unfortunately, some of the paint is gone from the sickle bar head, the black paint, but that's alright. The main thing is that the shroud where it says Eclipse Tornado is in good shape. And I didn't soap this down or anything, I just gave it a rinse, because the super clean that I use here to wash most of this equipment, it cuts through grease really well, but unfortunately it does take its toll on old paint on occasion, and I didn't want to risk it with this machine. So now that everything is cleaned up, what we are going to do is get this head pulled off of this engine and see what the valves look like underneath. So I thought I was going to be able to leave this shroud on this machine, but due to the lack of room that we have right here, in order to get this fan shroud off of the engine, I believe we're going to have to take this off. So it only goes on there with 6 bolts, so it'll be easy enough to pull off of there and get it out of our way. Well, looks like that's all it was, just a hung exhaust valve. It's got some rust in it. It's been sitting for a while, as I had mentioned. A couple of times now, I think. But the cylinder bore doesn't look too bad. It's glazed and there's a little bit of scoring on it here and there, but I think that'll run just fine and get plenty of compression once we get these valves cleaned up. So before we go ahead and clean this head up, I'm going to see if I can work this valve free in here. Which, being that it was in a barn and not out in the rain or anything, this shouldn't be too stuck. Nope. Can't beat that, folks. It was just stuck at the very top. Probably just some moisture in the barn and all that. That's starting to swivel real nice on there. Alright, well that was easy enough. That's probably the easiest stuck valve I've ever freed up. Alright, so now that that's taken care of, what I'll do, take this gasket off of here. I don't know if I have these any more new old stock gaskets of this size, so most likely we're going to end up reusing this. Once again, if it was a customer's machine, we'd be putting a new one on here and sourcing one, but like I said, this is just one of my own machines, and most likely I'll play around with it some, but it's definitely going to be a display item at the tractor shows, so I won't be getting a lot of use on it. So we'll get this cleaned up and we can get the head ready to go back on. So you guys just saw I went over this with some tool steel just to scrape off the heavy rust and the what little carbon there was left in between the valves and everything in the explosion area there, I guess you could say. So now I'm just going over it with a piece of 400 grit sandpaper, just lightly, so that way I can clean everything down to the machine surface again and the factory finish, I guess you could say. That way we can get everything to seal back up nicely. Top of the engine cleaned up well. So our valves are all cleaned up and everything's been decarboned along with the head of the piston. And I also cleaned up the head. I gave that a very quick scrubbing on the inside. I usually glass bead blast these, but for this machine this will be good enough. And then I also cleaned up the mating surface here. I made sure that was fairly clean. It was some 400 grit sandpaper as well. That way it mates up nicely against the gasket. So now everything's ready for reassembly. So now it's time to torque this head down, and everything is going to get torqued on the Model 6 Briggs to 140 inch-pounds. So we're going to bring everything down to probably about 70 or so, and then we'll finish it off at 140. Alright, so now we're going to go down to 140. Alright, the head's all torqued down, so now let's see what we got for compression. I'm not going to put a gauge on it or anything, but it doesn't have much, but it does have enough to run. So I know this thing doesn't have any sparks, so now we're going to have to get this flywheel pulled off of here and we can take a look at the points. Yeah, it looks like somebody snapped the end off this crank. Not much left to that. I'm gonna have to figure out a way to get that off of there. I usually use one of these flywheel knockers that Briggs & Stratton had, but since we don't have a crankshaft sticking out, We'll see if we can use this drift instead. That'll be enough to shock it. Yep. So worst case, there's just barely enough threads on here to catch that nut on here again to put everything back together. So I've had to go through this on the Kohler K series before, where if the end of the crankshaft snaps off like this, you can grind everything flush, center it with a center punch, and then you can drill and tap it for a bolt. And I've had to do that on the Kohlers before and put a 3/8 fine thread bolt in there. But I think we can get this to work still, and that'll be okay. And it looks like we might have a leaking oil seal up front here too, which would account for all the oil and stuff and the buildup inside the shroud. That's probably been leaking for quite a few years. And of course the back of the flywheel, as you can see, it's been spraying out everywhere. And this has also got the date code on it too, stamped in, or cast in there rather, 1954. Well, they don't look like they're pitted, but they sure as heck got a lot of oil on them. So we'll get those degreased. It will do the usual cleaning them up with some 400 grit sandpaper, and then most likely we'll get a nice hot spark out of those again. Points are all cleaned up. I also readjust the gap to 20 thousandths. It was a little bit tight, so I got those all squared away, and now we have a nice blue spark. Alrighty, so our engine shroud and our flywheel are all back on here. I also reinstalled the plug in the head, and I found a little screw tip for it because it was missing that on the original plug. So what we're going to do now is the fuel system, and because I'm just doing a really quick repair and startup on this unit, I am not going to open up this carburetor. I'm going to take a gamble and see if it'll start and run without splitting everything apart. Judging by the way that he cared for his equipment and the way that this was stored, I'm going to take a gamble that there isn't a bunch of shellac and dry powdery gas inside that carburetor, because the gas tank was clean and dry. There was no shellac or anything else, and no crustiness inside of it. So there's a good chance that the carburetor is the same way as well. So we'll get this fuel tank mounted back up here, and then we're going to have to get everything greased down inside here for the drive mechanism. So moving on to lubrication now, and this is what I like about this old equipment, even the stuff from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, I guess you could say, and even the cheap stuff like you'd find at your hardware store or a lawnmower shop. And back in the day, this might have been considered just a cheap throwaway machine. It was always built with serviceability in mind, which is really nice. We have a grease fitting up here at the pivot for the Sickle mower head. There is one missing from the ball and socket there, so I get another one installed. It has fittings down at the pivot points down inside here. We have the wheel drive clutch and the Sickle mower clutch up here. And there's also, as you can see, oil caps right there. You flip the cap up and you can fill it with oil for the shaft that goes underneath, that jack shaft. And of course we'll put a little bit of oil on these chains too. You can see they're just a little bit stiff. You got the kink in it right there, but all those will work themselves out once this engine is running. And on the back, once again, for the wheel drive, we have grease fittings on either side. So it's a nice, greasable, serviceable machine. So I'm also going to run some grease around these rings where the clutch forks ride, so that way they won't be dry when you go to engage and disengage these clutches. And we'll do the same thing for the wheel drive clutch underneath. Everything's all lubricated up, so the only thing I have left to oil is the drive chain down from the engine along with the wheel drive chains, and the one for the Sickle bar too. And then of course the cutter bar, once I get that moving, I'm going to spray some oil onto it and just let it work the rust off and everything else. So now we can get this thing off of the lift table, roll it outside, and see about getting it to fire up. We'll just splash a little bit in and see if anything's going to leak here. Hopefully not. Well, the Eclipse did pretty well over the weekend when it went on its maiden voyage. As you guys saw, I took it to the horse farm that I ride at and did a little bit of cutting around the fence lines and the pastures and everything else. And aside from the really heavy grass that was around the manure pile, it was getting bunched up in, everything else cut pretty darn well. It's better if you have some light duty mowing to do with this thing, because the really heavy grass does get bunched up in these rock guards and it's not moving fast enough to kind of let everything lay over as it gets cut. And of course, not having this bar on here that I mentioned before does cause stuff to get bunched up on the actuator lever and in the center there. So aside from that, the thing ran well, drove well, and everything else seemed to work pretty darn well. So folks, I'm happy with it. So it'll be a nice addition to the lineup for the tractor shows this year. So anyways folks, there's a basic repair and startup of the Eclipse Tornado 800 sickle bar mower.